Okay, so welcome back, everybody, and Happy New Year. I hope everybody is been able to start a good new year. I am not too sure, you know, when you're going to be able to be viewing this. I am recording this, on, New Year's Day. So my hope is to kind of get it out sometime this week, if not today. But this has been a lot longer than what I hoped. I am excited to have a new video out and everything else, but I've had a couple medical issues, a couple personal issues, so that has put me in a position where I have not been able to post a new video for a while, and oh, excuse me, and have not been able to, you know, do as much interesting things as I want to do, especially when it comes to like research and looking into different things. Um, I did change the background. We are not where we used to be. I moved some stuff around, and so I've been able to make, give us a better background. Here at my desk, I have my desk around me so I can have my paperwork, all of my interesting things near me. At the same time, I also have a lamp and my light, so I can have better lighting. I have better lighting around me, so I don't have to really worry about you guys seeing me. I could also kind of feel like this is a bit more comfortable than, the other place. I felt like the other place was a bit hard, so, I feel that this is a bit softer. So, with that being said, welcome back and welcome to a new year, and so let's get right into it. And so for today, the book that I want to go over is Mark Twain's Pudd'nhead Wilson. Now, this was written in 1984, so definitely keep that in mind. It is not a woke book. It is not a book that you can kind of be like, oh yeah, it's, you know, written near the end of the 1800s, and there's definitely some controversial things that go on in this book. At the same time, I am somebody that gets, and I explained it before, I am looking much deeper into stuff like this as, somebody that is into a lot of cultural studies and psychoanalytical studies. I'm also very much interested in feminist studies and some queer studies, all kinds of things. I still haven't found my exact roots and where I really want to expand. And this is probably one of the best books you want to get into. There's so many open interpretations, there's so many things going on that allows for this to really be a good book if you want to teach, literary studies. There's a lot of very good things in here, and there's been so many articles and things like that, and it's written very easy. I think really whenever I read it very easy. It's something that could be really read in high school, um, any age in high school really. Um, Maybe eighth grade. I probably wouldn't go any younger. There is a bit risky stuff. Um, but that's definitely something to keep in mind. So for this, there's really three characters that definitely exist in the entire novel and become very important for the understanding. And once they can kind of be introduced, and then we can really get into the thickness of the novel. Now, I really chose this novel. It's for me, it's a bit easier. I've written, this paper or two papers on it. I've done a whole lot with this novel. So it definitely has allowed for me to give a very easy introduction to the novel. It's also allowed for me to kind of get more into it versus some of the other books with everything that's been going on. So, to start out, let's go over some characters because that's really what's going to set off this book and some very interesting things. Um, the first character really to get into would be Roxy. Roxy is a slave in the South, and The interesting thing about Roxy is that her skin color is not dark. It is very light, and everything else, but she comes from mixed ancestry. And so that brings a new idea to the conversation, especially with, in the Deep South, where the idea of somebody being of mixed race means that they're still slave. They still do not have rights and everything else. Now, for Roxy, she has a child. Now, there are going to be two children that grow into adults, and the complication in this novel is that, what Roxy ends up doing. Roxy ends up having a child named Chambers, and she does not want her kid to go through a lot of the things that she's gone through, especially since her kid is white, has white skin color and everything else. So that leaves her in this situation where, what does she do? How does she try and make her child's life better than, what it is? And then it comes to her as, her master has a child. Her master has a young boy named Tom. Now, what does that mean? She was able to switch her child for another child, basically, to make sure that her child had a good life. Now, you know, for the rest of this video, I'm gonna try and, just keep their switched names because that's really what's gonna make it the easiest, versus, especially if you go and try to read the novel and everything else. So, what is, gonna be happening, is we see neither child being told that they were switched at birth. They grow up, they are raised, basically, as, their set positions, in society. Now, to make a quick note, this book was written, a couple years after the Civil War. It's like 25, 26 years after the Civil War. So that's one thing to definitely keep in mind is that this is not in any way an endorsement of anything that happened, the Civil War, slavery, all that stuff. But at the same time, it is definitely a comedy. There are so many things that happen that are, so comedic. And it really starts being funny and comedic, you know, and ironic after I get done like knocking y'all over. Um, Whenever Tom, is told by his mother that, his mother is not, the white heiress. In fact, you know, his mother is actually a slave. And this drives in a whole bunch of things. And of course, there are so many articles that I read. I'm going to definitely link a couple that I read that have definitely, giving me some interesting points of view. So that's something I definitely want to put out there. But it expl um it exfoliates and expands upon this idea of, culture and clothing and masking, because after that, Tom has to keep his identity a secret. If he is not, if his identity is not kept a secret, he's going to be a slave. They're going to switch places, and there becomes this interesting idea, especially in the novel, where um and what does clothing represent? Now, of course, one of the interesting things in one of the papers that I read was actually from Toni Morrison. Now, um, definitely an interesting, you know, article and everything else. And there's also a article that I read by Garber, and the fascinating thing about these is what is the importance of clothing. That is something that is so heavily exonerated and pushed in the novel because clothing is what makes the characters who they are. If it wouldn't be for the clothing, Roxy would be seen not as a slave, but as a white woman and everything else. So it becomes this bending of clothing and the importance of clothing. And one of the interesting moments is when Tom ends up, you know, dressing up as a woman, not once, he does it multiple times in the novel. So, we see this person who, once he is exposed, both to himself and, eventually to the rest of the novel and all other characters, as, an African, quote, quote, is the thing that he tries to cover up. And there's interesting depictions about what it means to conceal everything. And um in the novel we see him cross-dress as a old woman, and as a young lady, all these things. And this cross-dressing becomes something that is extremely, extremely important. Why? Well, when you think about the importance of clothing and what that represents, Tom is put into this position where he, you know, is exposed as a phony, and there's so much that goes along with it. Tom turns into this alcoholic. He, is a gambler. He, causes quite a ruckus. And, there's so many questions, especially by his mother, that's just like, so many things that is brought up, and it's just like, why are you like this? I gave you this opportunity, and here you're just acting, you know like a black person and everything else. There's a whole bunch of stereotypes that is in the novel, and once again, that is something very important to keep in mind, you know and that this is written, shortly after the Civil War. It is written as a novel to represent, you know, some of the rough stuff. It's not, something that I would say, you know, is quite an endorsement for our time, but it's this interpretation of, what it means to be white, what it means to be black. And especially in our current times, it still exists. And I think that that's where it becomes so important. These boundaries that are created in the novel around clothing. Clothing is all that separates, these two, characters, Chambers and Tom. And it becomes a huge, huge question about, you know, why is this going on? And what ends up happening is that Roxy ends up threatening to expose, you know, Chambers, and Tom as, frauds. It ends up that, you know, for the latter part of the book, we really don't see too much of Tom. Tom is raised as a slave, he works as a slave, and all these things. And it ends up being this situation where Tom is very much raised uneducated and everything else. And at the same time, it doesn't help that Roxy very much treats her kid crappy, well, her kid, you know. It ends up that Chambers is treated, you know, as an outcast even by his own quote quote mother. Roxy very much, shuns him away because he is everything that she is not, while at the same time he is. He has to be, this person, and so she has to raise him as a slave. And what ends up happening is that Tom ends up selling his mother, literally sells his mother up the river to protect himself, and it ends up curling even more into this idea of what it means to be clothed, what it means to be white, and what is whiteness. But at the same time, it is a very much a broad statement about blackness and how blackness really is effective in this novel. Now, the other interesting thing, it's definitely pointed out in the two articles that I'm specifically going to link below, but of course, I might link others, in is, this thing where we see Tom cross-dressing. Now, why might this be interesting and everything else, is that he gets caught, especially. And it's this thing where this concealment, this femininity, especially in a man that is supposed to be white, but he's black and is, you know, supposed to act real and up, you know, but at the same time, he is very much, he turns into a drunkard, a gambler, he wastes all his money, um, there ends up being a murder and he's behind it, all these things. And so it leaves so much, in the face where, we see this cross dressing that has allowed for him to once again find an escape away from his life. He, you know, cross dressed before from, black to white. And now, especially in the thicker part of the novel, we see him switch from male to female. And, there's these escapes from this world that Tom is stuck in. Tom is stuck, especially once he finds out and knows that this is his life. He is not white, he is black, according to the standards of society. And he is forced into a situation where, he ends up murdering someone, and all that stuff. And just a side note, I'm going to not reveal as many of the key things, especially that way you can read the book, you can find out who he murders and all this stuff. Um, but Tom, especially, cross-dressing, he wears women's clothing, and all these things as his disguise, as his escape, as his way of getting out of this really weird, messed up world that he ends up finding himself in. But at the same time, it's set up as a comedy. There are so many times in the novel where it's just like, what? What's going on? Why is this happening? And I definitely think we see the collapse of, you know, whiteness and blackness, but at the same time, we see this affirmation and confirmation of blackness and whiteness. I think I use that word right. If I'm not, just yell at me. It's okay. Um, because, there's this understanding in the novel and everywhere else, um, that if you're black, you act a certain way, and if you're white, you act a certain way. And this is something that Tom has confronted time and time again, where, Roxy, his real mother, confronts him and is just like, "Look, kid, you're gonna expose yourself. People are gonna look at you and everything else." At the same time, you know, Tom being this top, he is in a family that is very rich, has a lot of money, and here he is acting very stupidly. And one of the most iconic moments in the novel that very much, reveals who Tom is whenever Tom is walking down the street. He is in, this full outfit and, basically what is oh, excuse me, seen as, the pinnacle of whiteness, and it talks about, his vest and all these things, you know, dressing the part. And, a couple paces behind him is a black man, you know, mocking him behind him. And it is, very much a symbol that there's, you can cover yourself up, you can change your clothes, you can do this, that, and the other, but you're still who you are at the end of the day. And it becomes so much of an identifier of the culture and what is going on that no matter who you are, what you try to change yourself, you are where you come from. As, really to try and prevent, these videos from going longer. And of course, if, you guys want more, I can definitely go do a deeper dive, go into certain things. Um, Especially Morrison's piece. Morrison's piece was very interesting. I enjoyed that one. Um, but definitely searching and finding new things to kind of look into is, how does this kind of connect to life? How does this connect to us? Um, and I think one of the most important things is, especially now, is this understanding of identity. Now, Tom identifies as white, everything else, and when Roxy tells him, you're black, he very much has the option to not acknowledge that, to stay, as he is. And instead, you know, he, has acted white his entire life. And this exposure of being black, even though in no way, shape, or form has it changed him, his upbringing, nothing, it changes who we see Tom is as he becomes a gambler, a drunk, all these things. He himself has changed his identity in the novel by the knowledge that he is not white. He is, in fact, black. Now, of course, you know, Mark Twain is somebody that has written some very edgy novels, and it is very important to understand he is very much, you know, known for some of the things he's written. But it becomes extremely important in this understanding of clothing and gender identity, you know, where you identify yourself and then you expose yourself. You personify whatever you want it to be. And we see it also with gender in the novel. Whenever he cross dresses as a woman, he cross dresses as an old woman and a young woman. Um, and when he's caught, he actually flirts with the person that he's caught with. He's caught whenever somebody walks by a window and sees in, and he blows a kiss to them, and everything else. So there is this manipulation of character and who you are. And in this novel, we see that. We see this, complication of who you are, who you want to be. But at the same time, there's this complexity that says no matter what you change, who you know, you are what you came from. And the most interesting part about all that is that nothing changes until you make it change, until you make that identity exist, you know. And we see that in Tom as, you know, he had no idea for, his most of his life, depicted in the novel. And Chambers doesn't know at this point, especially um, when we see the court hearing and everything else later in the novel, which is I recommend, especially for that part, because it is an interesting part. But there is this idea that is brought up, which is, you know, and today we even see it where it is the education and knowledge that is put into somebody makes them who they are, but at the same time, it brings up the question of, can you change who somebody is? Can you reverse something after, something has been confirmed, after, evidence is, brought forward, and once, your secrets are blown. In this novel, one of the biggest questions, especially for me, was what do you do with Chambers? What do you do with Tom, especially once their identities are blown? You know, for Tom, you throw him back, as a slave, whatever, it doesn't matter, you know, and it's just, it goes back, he goes back to being Chambers, he's no longer Tom. But Chambers is now, you know, especially once he finds out, that he's white, he's been raised his entire life as a slave. He's, you know, raised in that kind of education. There's so much that goes into that, and there has been so many studies, especially when it comes to child development, that's, deals with these kinds of things. But then you're brought to this situation where what do you do with something like that? What do you do whenever somebody's identity has been changed, whenever something revolutionary that would drastically change who somebody is, who they identify as, what, their life is? And in that situation, it becomes a question of what does the clothing mean? You know, for Chambers, if he changes his clothes, back to Tom, he changes to who he really is. Does that mean that he's white? Could he identify as white? Could his identity be, somebody that is white? Or is he stuck in this blackness? Is he stuck in, this slave world? He spent his entire life, I think, trying to remember. I think that he's in his 20s, they're both in their 20s whenever this all becomes realized. So it becomes this idea that, you know, what happens? What happens whenever, somebody's identity, whenever somebody's um, world, their knowledge is suddenly overturned, especially in the world of education and all these things, what happens in these situations? And that's where clothing no longer, matters. It's, ooh, after I get done like throwing my hair everywhere, you know, these things are what make, Pudd'nhead Wilson interesting. There's this weird complexity to it, while at the same time it's not. It's a very easy novel, simple novel. And but yet Mark Twain proposes this idea that what does it really mean to be white and what does it really mean to be black? And there's this complication, to whiteness and blackness and this battle in gender studies. Um and I think that oh, it's definitely something that for me becomes a battle, especially today we have the battles for LGBT rights and stuff like that, and you know dressing the part, everything like that. Still, from Pudd'nhead Wilson to today is definitely something that is important. We see, Tom being this character who has all intensive purposes made it. He went from being a slave, he's now free, he now owns his own slave, he sells his own mother, he does all these things, and yet he's ripped back to this world of slavery and everything else once everything comes to light. And that's where there is so much complexity, but yet there's simplicity. And that's something that especially in Pudd'nhead Wilson is asked in gender studies and in cultural studies. You know, where does you know where does that leave a character whose life you know is changed in this kind of situation? And I think, especially for me, it's interesting now. Uh, it's weird in this novel that we see this kind of weird complexity. Now, there's especially for this time, there's a lot of novels and books that deal with, slavery, slave rebellion, all that stuff, and of course, those are books we can definitely go over as well. Um, the one of the best ones is the Bondwoman's Narrative, which kind of does the same thing. It is a very light-skinned woman who is attempting to escape to freedom and ends up being captured and whatever. Um, Actually, I think I have that the wrong novel, but you can yell at me in the comments. But to bring in an interesting part of this novel is that battle of clothing and what does the clothing represent and who does your clothing make you. um I think that that's really where it comes in, and I hope that you guys read it, or if you have read it, you know bring in interesting ideas. And I'm always happy, if you comment below or whatever. I'll always, you know I have the Penguin Classic, but of course I'm always happy to, if you comment something or find something interesting, I'm always happy to, go in and find it. Now, for me, I laugh because in my books I have so much written. Like, I have things underlined, I have comments in and that's something that I definitely encourage. Now, I know that we're now, probably soon going to be running over 30 minutes, but I definitely want to, encourage you, buy the book, read the book, and see what you think. Dive into some interesting ideas, and this is, once again, it is an interesting book. It's a easy book to read, and you know it battles with gender studies. It battles with blackness and whiteness, and even though at this point it's over 100 and going on 40 years old, you know it still rings true. It still has very, very you know interesting things that are going on. And I encourage you to buy the book, or rent it, whatever. Make notes, and have ideas, especially with the articles that I'm going to link below. I encourage you to also read them. Check them out. They're very easy reads. In total, it shouldn't take very long. I think whenever I read the articles, it was short. It might have taken me, you know, to for me to read it and all that stuff. It probably didn't take me, more than 30 minutes or so, which kind of sounds long, but at the same time, I read them, and then had to like think of what I wanted to write. Um, but it definitely comes to this area where I encourage you to always think critically, especially with a novel like this, um, and what it means to be white, what it means to be black, what is whiteness, what is blackness, and, this idea of cross dressing, not just um, for, you know, male to female, female to male, or whatever, but also cross dressing in the means of, cultural studies, going from, in this novel, it's blackness to whiteness. In other novels, it would be different, or in other circumstances, it would be different. So I definitely encourage that. Of course, there are so many other interesting things to say about this novel, but I don't want to go too far. I definitely wanted to make sure that it was a good intro to the new year. These are I'm hoping to have more in-depth, looks and everything else. I kind of was shortcommed with this one because of, the intro and everything else, but I definitely encourage you to take a deep look into Pudd'nhead Wilson. I think um my copy is like, it's like 303 pages, which sounds like a lot, but in reality, it reads fast. There are some parts where it can be a little hard to read because of um the the way that it's written. It's written kind of, how it's would be spoken, which is something to definitely consider. Um, but it does read quick. It's not something that for me, I think that, you would really sit and it would take you, very long. Even the audiobook, I don't think would, you know, be too long. It might be something, but it's definitely something, if you're out exercising or you're in the car or whatever, like if you're listening to the audiobook and, you know, you have like a 30-minute drive, both way or whatever, if you have like 15-minute there, 15 back, and you'd listen to it the entire time, it wouldn't take you long. So I recommend that for this book. Just listen to it, read it, and come back with ideas and stuff like that. Even if you haven't read it and everything else, come, you know, give me, feedback. What do you think about stuff like this? As a white male, it's a very interesting coming into a situation like reading Pudd'nhead Wilson. So I encourage you, your feedback, your ideas, and until next time, Happy New Year and peace, love, and joy, my friends.